we've heard a lot of new techniques, and we've heard a lot of new future directions in which we can sort of protect our children. And maybe EAH Loeffen can continue on this and tell us about infusion duration of anthracyclines. He's a PhD student from the Netherlands doing excellent work on guideline development and has done this research together with Wim and me.
Thank you, Marianne, for this kind introduction, and thank you for having me here to speak to you. Good morning, everybody. Today I will be talking about the evidence regarding the infusion duration of anthracyclines. Does it matter to the heart? To reduce cardiotoxicity, naturally there are various ways to do so. You could say we will omit anthracyclines, but since they are quite effective, we don't want to do that as of now. You could maybe lower the dose, but that might also put your survival chances in jeopardy. But one of the things you can do is change the way you administer it. So for instance, we looked at if the duration has an effect on the outcomes, on the cardiac outcomes. Unfortunately, there are no pharmacological companies that deem me interesting enough to have me promote their products, so I have no disclosures. And this is a picture I like to show of the town, well, the city where I work. It's called Groningen, so it's a very Dutch name. You could also recognize it's Holland because everything is flat and it's surrounded by meadows with cows that you can't see on this picture. But what is quite unique in Holland, and I think unique internationally, is that our city center is, do you see the mouse? I don't think so, right? Well, there's a tower, and in addition, I'm colorblind, so I can see the beamer. Well, the city center is located where the church is, and on the right you see a white, large building. That's the University Hospital. So the University Hospital is literally a 100-meter walk away from the very city center. So it's really nice to be so immersive in the city and not on a campus on the city bound. So that's quite unique, and I urge everyone to visit our beautiful city of Groningen. Today I will be talking about the guideline we have developed. On the left you see a representation of our guideline panel who has developed this guideline and who's putting all the puzzle pieces together to find out that there aren't that many pieces of the puzzle. And on the right you see the published guideline, and it's really a story where the title gives away the plot. It's titled "The Duration of Anthracycline Infusion Should Be at Least 1 Hour in Children with Cancer." But today I will focus on the part in between. So what's the evidence that we made our decisions on? First of all, it's good to start with defining what we mean with guidelines, because there are various definitions for guidelines, and people tend to say very easily that something is a guideline when they've decided it over a beer in a bar and say, this is what we're going to do, so this is our guideline from now on. But the Institute of Medicine from the United States defined guidelines a few years ago as trustworthy guidelines should be based on a systematic evidence review developed by a panel of multidisciplinary experts, provide a clear explanation of the logical relationships between alternative care options and health outcomes, and provide ratings of both the quality of evidence and the strength of recommendations. And it's a long sentence, but there are very important points in there. So for instance, the systematic evidence review, if you want to make an evidence-based guideline, you should base it on evidence. It sounds really logical, but it doesn't happen all the time. So you really should do a good systematic search to capture everything that you want to capture to make your decision on. One of the other important points is somewhere in the middle, the logical relationship. To explain it, it's pivotal for guidelines to explain why you make a certain recommendation, because quite often people are afraid that guidelines is just cookbook medicine, and as healthcare professionals you just have to follow them, but they are named recommendations. So it's always, if you can argue that you should have another path to follow with your specific patient and also talking to your patient, then naturally you can do that. And that's why it's so important in guidelines to make your thoughts of the guideline panel insightful, so people can understand it, follow it, and maybe if they want to deviate from it, know why they do it. I don't know if everybody is familiar with the GRADE methodology. GRADE is a working group from the McMaster University, and they are to, well, I think they did to guidelines what the Beatles did to the pop music, but I don't think they are that popular yet. I think they should be. But they make a very clear distinction between the quality of evidence and the strength of the recommendation. So for the quality of evidence, you've got very low quality, moderate quality, and high quality. And that's based on various factors. So for instance, the study design, if you have a randomized controlled trial, the quality will automatically start as high, and you could maybe downgrade it for certain things like a small study size, imprecision, those kind of things. And there are also factors for which you can upgrade if you find a large effect. Then the strength of the recommendation, it can be weak and strong. So you don't have a lot of categories to choose from, and that makes it very easy to use. And naturally you can have a weak recommendation for something or against something, and it's the same for a strong recommendation. And how you should interpret these is that with a weak recommendation you suggest something, and you're saying a lot of the people would want this option, but there's also a large number of people who would not want this option. So in that case it's really about patient preferences, logistical issues, and it's more fine-tuning with your patient what he or she wants. And with a strong recommendation you say, we recommend this. And most people in that specific situation would want that certain treatment, and most clinicians would want to provide that treatment. Naturally, there are always cases in which you can divert from that, but it's what you then recommend. A lot of times people think that if you've got very low quality evidence, you automatically have a weak recommendation. If you've got high quality evidence, you got a strong recommendation, but it's not the case. It can go really in all directions. You can have very high quality evidence comparing option A with option B, but maybe your conclusion is we don't know what's best, so then it will still be a weak recommendation. I think one of the most simple and notorious example is the parachute example. There's only very low quality evidence that a parachute will prevent you from dropping dead when you jump out of a plane, but still I don't think people would only suggest wearing a parachute. I think everybody would recommend wearing one. If you are developing a guideline, this is something of an overview. So you start with a clinical question, you do your systematic evidence review, you rate your quality of the body of evidence over every outcome. You see what do we have and what kind of quality do we think it is. And then you come together with a large panel. And it's really important to have a representative panel. So for this cardiotoxicity guideline, we got a pediatric oncologist, cardiologists, pharmacologists, nurses, patient representative, parent representative. So I think we were with 12 in all, 12 people. We formulated 2 clinical questions in the PICO format, so that's patient, intervention, control, and outcome. Naturally, we wanted to look at children with cancer receiving anthracyclines. And we wanted, for outcomes, we wanted to look at clinical heart failure, subclinical heart failure, tumor response, progression-free survival, overall survival, adverse effects other than the cardiac damage, quality of life and costs. And what we wanted to compare was various infusion times. And we said the first comparison we will make is to compare a push infusion, so something below 1 hour, with something that is with an infusion duration that is an hour or longer. But also we wanted to see if there are changes in longer infusion time. So the second question we had was to compare infusion durations between 1 to 6 hours with 6 hours or more. So we only included studies that compared groups based on infusion duration, so the cumulative anthracycline doses had to be the same or almost the same. And we only included randomized controlled trials. So the basis for the guideline was a Cochrane review, and in all we included 7 studies. We decided beforehand that we would include all ages. Naturally, we would love to only include pediatric studies, but most of the times in pediatric oncology, and especially in pediatric oncology supportive care, there's not that much evidence available. So for this guideline, we wanted to include all ages. As you can see, there are 3 studies included that regard adults and 3 studies included that regard children. There's 1 study included where the age was not mentioned, and I would urge you all to develop a guideline, first of all, because it's nice work that is also needed in clinics, but also because you learn to appraise articles, and you see that a lot of the times very vital information is missing. So this was 1 study that did not report the age of their patients, which was quite surprising. But since all 62 patients were breast and ovarian cancer patients, we categorized it as an adult study. So in all, we had 800 participants included, and if you then look at what clinical question they were handling, you see that almost all studies were focusing on question A, so that's the push infusion shorter than 1 hour versus longer than 1 hour. There was only 1 pediatric study that looked at an infusion time comparing 1 hour to 24 hours, but you can see that the rest of them really is comparing a push infusion, so it's almost all studies are 15 minutes or even a bolus, and comparing it to a very prolonged infusion. So the shortest one is 6 hours and the longest one is 96 hours. So that's quite a wide range. If I provide you with an evidence, I would like to start with the question for which we had the least evidence. That's the second one, for which only we had 1 study. So it's the question comparing a infusion time longer than 6 hours with an infusion time between 1 and 6 hours. And I don't know if you can read this, but I'll talk you through it. There was only 1 study included, only 1 pediatric study included, and I will show you the findings in a second. And the adult table is empty. So that's always a bit of a depressing finding, but also on a positive note, an interesting finding to see that there's no evidence on that and that there's a potential for a new study. If you look at the pediatric study that was included, it wasn't that useful because the follow-up time was only 7 days. So yeah, what does it say about the development of long-term cardiac outcomes? They found, unsurprisingly, no cases of clinical or subclinical heart failure, and that was because the study really aimed to look at the response rate between those different infusion times, and the response rate was similar, as you can see. So that left us in a very uncomfortable situation, because the GRADE working group is understandably pushing everybody to formulate a recommendation. Even if you have very limited evidence, you should still try to make a recommendation, because a clinician in practice will never have the effort or the time or the expertise from various multidisciplinary angles to appraise the evidence and come to a conclusion. But yeah, for this we talked about it for quite a while, but we reluctantly admitted that formulating a recommendation was not possible in this case. My computer went to Windows, but it's still working, so that's good. If we look at the other question, that's a bit more uplifting. This is the overview for the evidence for the push infusion versus the 1 hour or longer infusion. And then you can see from the pediatric studies that we've got 2 studies included. I'll try to make it a bit larger here, otherwise I can't talk you through it. Yeah, that's better. I will come to the conclusions in a second. Let's see. So there was 1 study of 120 participants, all children who were administered doxorubicin, where they looked at clinical heart failure. They had a follow-up time of a maximum of 5 years, and they found no cases of clinical heart failure, so that's probably too early to develop it. And they also looked at subclinical heart failure, and there they didn't find any significant differences. If you look at the adult data, luckily enough, there's some more data, and I see now that although this one is changing, there we are again with the adult evidence. So we've got 4 studies included that looked at clinical heart failure, subclinical heart failure, and at response rate. If you look at the most interesting finding, because I haven't got the time to really dive into all the individual studies. With the guideline panel, I think we took about 2 hours or 2 or 3 hours to really in detail discussed the studies we had and also discussed the strength and the limitation of the study so that everybody was really into the evidence. We also did that with the parent and patient representatives, and that was also a very nice exercise to do. But I think this is the most important finding, that if you look at clinical heart failure, these are all studies with a bit of a longer follow-up time, but in most studies the follow-up time isn't even mentioned, so that's another limitation of reporting. But you see that they use doxorubicin and epirubicin, and if you look at clinical heart failure at the end of follow-up, it's more prevalent in the group that had a shorter infusion time. So with the push infusion group, you see that 19 out of 213, so that's about 10%, developed clinical heart failure, and in the group that had an infusion duration longer than 1 hour, you see it's only 4 out of 223, so that's about 2%. So if you look at the effect size, at the risk ratio was 0.22, so it's a 5-fold decrease in risk for developing clinical heart failure if you prolong the infusion time. So following the grade methodology, you then start to complete an evidence to decision framework, and that's a really neat method to come from your evidence to your recommendation, because it's not as clear cut that you say this is our conclusion from our evidence, so this will be a recommendation. You really are discussing, are the benefits large, are the undesirable effects small, but also what is the impact on health costs and health inequities. So for instance, if you can imagine if you admit children for 96 hours, other than that it's very expensive and it takes a lot of personnel to care for them, it's also for the children themselves. They have to be in the hospital for 4 days, miss a lot of school, miss interaction with friends, and that if you could do that in 2 hours maybe in a daycare, that would be a very attractive option. So in the end, and if you're interested, please look for the guideline, and you can see the complete evidence to decision table. But we said that the desirable consequences probably outweigh the undesirable consequences in most settings. And after discussion, we chose to make it a strong recommendation to recommend an infusion duration of at least 1 hour for anthracycline chemotherapy in children with cancer. So there you see an example that we've got. If you looked at the studies were not that good. The studies were in adults mainly, so you rate down for indirect evidence. So in the end, we had very low quality evidence, but still, given the group discussion and given the effect size, we were comfortable to make a strong recommendation for this. Unfortunately, we weren't able to recommend a more precise infusion time. We were hoping to say, well, you should do it in 6 hours or in 12 hours, but given the current evidence base, that's simply not possible. So that's really an opportunity for research to seek if we can make it, if there's a difference between 1 hour or 6 hours or 12 hours, because it's got quite big implications on quality of life and economic issues. So the take-home messages are very simple. Anthracyclines, don't push it. Do it at least in 1 hour. A lot of people say, so what should we do then? Because hospital A is doing it in 6 hours and hospital B in 12 hours, what should we do? And then we say, you can either continue with what you were doing, if it's at least 1 hour, and one of the nice things would be at least to harmonize it amongst the centers so that you've got one strategy to do it. Another take-home message, which I find very important, is that a strong recommendation is possible even though you have limited evidence, but you have a good multidisciplinary panel. And to end with the science bomber, more evidence is needed, more research is needed, but that's why we are here, so that we can do future studies. I want to leave it at that, and I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a great Congress.